So we've got a React application that can create data, and we have a means to display that data to our users, but we have no way to let a user sign in and to tie that data to them. So today we are going to add authentication to our application using email and password, and also a Facebook application. Our application makes it look like you've signed in when you look at these icons in the header over here, but as of right now, nobody can actually get in here and own any of the music that they've created. So that's kind of a bummer, and we're going to fix that today. We have a lot of stuff to cover in this particular tutorial, and all of it's going to wrap around authentication. So we're going to cover logging in, logging out, user sign up, and how to make our React app feel good while we're logging in and logging out, since it has to maintain state in a way that's not standard if you're used to working with server-rendered applications. If we come over to the Firebase console and you look in the sidebar here, you're going to have this authentication tab. So if you click that, you'll see that we don't have any users, but we want sign-in methods. So we are already using Firebase as our data backend, but we are going to use it as the backend provider for our authentication also. And for this particular tutorial, I'm going to cover two ways of doing it. One, because it's the standard normal way for people to sign into a website, and the other one because it's a way that people like to sign into websites. So we're going to cover email password. You're going to want to click on this, hit enable, and then save. And then we're also going to cover Facebook. And you're going to click on this, and the app ID and app secret fields are going to be empty for you. So you're going to want to go and fill these in, but we're going to have to go and create a Facebook application to be able to do that. So to create a Facebook application, we need to go to developers.facebook.com/apps. This will have you sign in with your normal Facebook account, and then you can create an application. I already have the one that I was using. I'm going to have to regenerate the secret key, obviously, because you've seen it now. But we can go through and generate a new one. So this is just going to be my fake app. And then when we, oh boy, I can never spell these things. CQN7 maybe. Once we have our application created, we need to add products to it. And the only one we actually care about is Facebook login. So we're going to click setup on this. And in the sidebar, you can see the quick start is highlighted. We don't actually want that because it's pretty easy to set this up without going through this. We're going to hit settings instead and come over here. These are already on by default, the client OAuth and web OAuth. We want embedded browser OAuth login also, so we're going to click that. And then the other thing we need is we need to paste our URL into here. So come over to the Firebase console, copy this, and bring it over here. And make sure you hit enter so it turns into a bubble. And then you can save your changes. And then go to the dashboard, and you'll be able to grab the two pieces of information that we actually want from this. So we want the app ID, and then we want the, whoops, I'm not going to actually put my password in. You want the app secret that you'll have to put your password in to look at. Once you have those, you take them over here, fill them in, and click save. And that's actually the last thing that we're going to do inside the Firebase console, setting anything up. We're going to come in here a little bit later on to see as users are being created, but that is actually it for the setup part. So if we look at what we want the flow of this change to actually be, when somebody comes to the website, they go to just / in our path up here. What they should see isn't this over here on the right side. It should be something like a button. So we're going to put a register and login button over here. And then when they click on it, it's going to take them to a login form that will allow them to log in with Facebook or log in with email and password. And then once they fill that out, it'll punt them back over here, and they should see these icons in the header. So let's start with modifying the header to be based off of this authenticated state, and then we'll move into building out our form. So if we take a look at our header first, we have everything here is pretty much solid, except for the search field we don't want to show, and then we want to show something slightly different down here. So we are going to use a ternary operator in order to do that. So this will be a this.props.authenticated, which we haven't passed in yet. And then if it's there, it's going to render out this input. Otherwise, it's going to render null. And that's all we need for that one. And then down here, we're actually going to take this entire outer div and do the same thing. So we'll say, I wonder if I can get this to indent properly if I do it this way. So we want that to be in this first one. So if you're authenticated, you see all of this. Otherwise, you see this thing completely different. It's not going to let me indent that properly. But we want a div. And this is going to have a class name of pt navbar group and pt align right. It's literally the same thing that we had up there. So we have the same outer container shape. And then in here, though, we only want a single thing. We want a link that has a class name of pt button with pt intent primary. And the way intents work inside a Blueprint is an intent is a blue like standard button. Intent success is green. Danger is red. Warning is kind of an orangey yellow. So this is just how you can apply color to some of the things inside of the library itself. Next, we're going to give this a 2, and that's going to go to/login. And then it'll say register/login. Then we just need to make sure we close our squiggly brackets here, and we should be good. Everything will compile, and we should see a button now. When we click this button, it's going to take us to a path that doesn't actually do anything, so this will fall into the root path. And that's okay. Now we have to go back over to our application. And the first thing that we used was the prop of authenticated on our header. So for that, we're actually going to add some state. Going to be authenticated, and by default you should not be authenticated, which I think makes sense. And then down here we need to pass that in. So authenticated, this.state.authenticated, and this should still compile, still work. We should be good. So this leaves us in the spot where we're going to need to create our login component and then create a route for it and to go from there. So we're going to build the component without any of the actual login bits first. We're just going to build up the HTML and the actual thing that we can use in a route. And then we will come back, and the last thing we're going to do is build the actual interaction with Firebase for login. So let's create source components login.js. This is going to be a React component. Whoops. Oh, I messed that up. So it'll be login. And then there are going to be quite a few things kind of going on in this particular component. So I think we'll start by building out the render function, and then we'll kind of backfill in the other functions that we need. So we're going to have an outer div, obviously. And then we're going to close that off. And then the way I'm really foreseeing this is we want the top part of this container to be buttons that just say login with X. So it would be login with Facebook is the one we're going to add. But if you wanted to have a different provider, like say GitHub or Twitter, then you could do that too. And you could put that in the same section here, and the styles would actually still work out pretty well. So we're going to just add a button for that, and that's going to have some style to it. And we'll give it a width of 100%. And then class name wise, we're going to go back and do the PT button thing again, and then PT intent primary. And then on click, we want this to go and trigger the this.auth with Facebook function that we haven't written yet. And then we can close this and just have it say log in with Facebook. So that's going to be our top part. And then we're going to have a horizontal rule just to give some separation between these two parts because they are kind of distinctly different. And we're going to have a margin top of 10 pixels and a margin bottom of 10 pixels. And that's about it for the horizontal rule. Next thing we want is we want a div to kind of explain what I explained. Or actually, I might not have explained this yet. Our form is going to only have one. So there's not a register and a login form. There's a register/login form. And what that is going to give us is if you fill in your email and your password and you submit that, if you don't have a user, we will create one for you with that password. And then if you do have a user, we will try to log you in. If you don't, or if you have a user and your password's wrong, we'll show you the password is wrong error. And then we actually have to handle another case that is, you actually have a user with the email address you're trying to use, but you signed in with Facebook. We'll give you a separate message that tells you to try one of the alternative authentication providers. So we're going to put a little kind of info box here that's going to tell the user about this. So we'll give div style, and this is going to have margin bottom of 10 pixels. And then the class name of PT callout is what it's called. And then it can have an icon, so it'll have a PT icon info sign. Close the div. Now we can put h5 note. Close the h5. And lastly, if you don't have an account already, this form will create one. All right, now we're onto our form. So this will be the biggest part of the DOM that we have to manipulate here. So we have a form that has an on submit because we want you to not have to click the button in order to actually trigger the form submission. And that's going to give us an event. And then we're going to pass that to this auth with email password event. And then the other thing we want is we want a ref. And this is a reference that we can store to a particular piece of the DOM. And in this particular case, what we want is we're going to pass in the form to this ref, and then that is going to set this.login form equals form. And what this is actually doing is this means when we interact with one of our bound functions like auth with Facebook, auth with email password, those are going to be bound to this object. We can call this.login form and it will give us this form. And the reason we're going to use that is we'll use it to reset the form after somebody has successfully submitted. Oh, whoops. This should go inside the form anyway. We have two distinct sections and this is kind of part of that. Okay, now the next thing we want is we want a label with a class name of PT label. And then inside the label, we're going to have the word email. And then we want an input that has a style. Simple styles here, we're just doing width 100%. And then it has a class name of PT input, name of email, type of email. This lets us leverage some browser built-in email validation for us if this application were to grow, we might want to build our own so that we can have our own custom messages because the email validation messages in browsers are kind of ugly sometimes. And then lastly, we want a ref to the input, and this is going to be this.email input equals input. And once again, this works in the same way that we just had that ref up above. This lets us grab this email input directly to get the value off of so that we can use it when we are calling things inside of our functions. And then we'll give it a placeholder of email. And we can close that off. Now we'll copy this entire label chunk, paste it, and then in here, we're going to replace the word email with password everywhere. We're going to reselect that stuff and replace capital email with password. And we've created the password section too in exactly the same way. So the last thing we need is our button to submit it. And if we do that, we'll have width of, you guessed it, 100%. And then this will be of type submit. Class name of PT button, PT intent primary with a value of login. Okay, and that is our entire form. So we have a couple functions that we need to bind. And if we need to bind functions, we're going to have to do that in the constructor at some point. So let's go and create that. Call super on props. And then this dot auth with Facebook. Bind this. And then we'll do the same thing for the email password version. Now, we'll just define these so that we can see that they're being called, but we don't actually need to do anything with them just yet. So in this one, we'll say that we authed with Facebook. And then in our next one, this will be a little bit more complicated. So this one is going to take an event, remember, from the form. Oops. And then we're going to prevent that event. And this is so that when we click it, it actually doesn't change the page. By default, it's going to post to the action, which isn't there, and that's going to cause our page to refresh. So we're going to prevent that, and then we are going to console.log. And this will be a little bit more intense because I actually want to see that our fields are wired up properly. So we can console.table actually. And I don't know if I've ever showed this, but if you take an array of objects and you pass it to console.table, it will kind of print it out in an actual like structured table in your console, which is really neat to see. So we'll take the value for the email input first, and then we will replace that with password. And then I guess we'll put a authed with email. Okay, so that gives us all the functions that we need. We have our top constructor done, and we should be good to go. Now we have to use this in our app and see what we see. So let's import it first. Do that, and then find a route down here. And this is actually going to be the simplest route we've made to date, and it's going to be exact with the path of login. And then you can actually say component, component equals, and then you just put the name of a component, or put an actual component in here, and that will do it for us. So when we hit /login, it will just instantiate one of these, and since it currently doesn't take any arguments to instantiate it, we don't need to do anything fancy. So if we look back, looks like we have a couple of, oh, I forgot to add an extra squiggly bracket to close that on the form. There we go. And now everything compiles. So if we come back over here, we have a register login button, and we click it, it renders this. This is really wide, so we want to put some containing styles around that. So let's do that now. So we're going to do that by creating a const out here called login styles. This is going to have just some width stuff. So we'll have 90%. We want to leave 5% on both sides. We'll give it a max width of 315 pixels, and that'll work on, I'm doing this again. These need to be commas, not like it's real CSS. 315 pixels would be wide enough for it to look good on a phone, or narrow enough, I should say, for it to look good on a phone. And it'll still look good on all size devices. So let's put the margin of 20 pixels auto to bump it down a little bit and center it. And then we're going to give it a little bit of a border around the border and add some padding. Now that we've got our styles, we will come back down and put this in here. So we'll say style, login styles, save that, make sure everything compiles, and come back over. And now it looks much more reasonable. And if we were to scroll the screen, it would work out fine. It would center itself, and it would get a little bit more narrow as it needs to. So let us open up our inspector and see what's in the console here. So if I click on auth with Facebook, we're triggering the proper event. That's good. Now, if I come over here and I just type some stuff in, type some stuff down here, you'll see that we actually get the email validation saying, hey, you at least need to have an @ sign, and that's all fine and dandy. So we'll put an actual email address in and then click login, and you'll see that we logged in with email. And this is what console.table does, and actually lets you sort things, which is really neat. So it's basically a spreadsheet inside of your console. Okay, so now we're in a spot where we can actually rig up some authentication to happen, but we need to go change some few things. So up to this point, we've been using Rebase for all of our interactions with Firebase, and that exists in our base.js is where we set that stuff up, but we only export our base. So let's go take a look at this. So if we go to base.js, we export base down here. We need to export app because Firebase has authentication built in, and Rebase used to handle that authentication with some of its own custom methods, but it has since decided that it wants to really just deal with the data. And for the authentication stuff, the Firebase API is really good, and you can just use what's there from the Firebase package that you already had to import. So we're going to do that too. And another thing we're going to initialize in here in return is a provider that is for Facebook. And so since Facebook is a provider, email password is a provider, but you don't have to create an object for it. But if you were to do something like GitHub, you would create an actual provider object for that too. So right here, we're going to say Facebook provider, and this is going to be a new Firebase auth Facebook auth provider. And then we want to export that too so that we can utilize that inside of login. So now if we go back to our login component, we're going to import quite a few new things, and we want a redirect. So after somebody successfully signs in, we can redirect them somewhere. We want a thing from Blueprint called a toaster, which allows us to show flash messages. And then we are going to pull in app and the Facebook provider so that we can interact with that. So let's first import redirect from React Router DOM. And then we're going to import toaster and intent from Blueprint JS core. And then the last thing that I said we needed is we're going to import our own stuff. So we're going to import app and Facebook provider from base. And remember, we have to go back one directory in order to do that. So now that we have those things in place, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a little bit of state to know whether or not we should redirect. So if we remember what state does, state is the internal thing. So these are things we should use internally to our component to know how to show and render different things. So redirect is a piece of state that we're going to use to say that by default, you shouldn't redirect, so you should render a form. But if we update our state to say redirect true, then the component will trigger us to go to a different thing. So it'd be equivalent to saying this.location equals some new URL, essentially. So down here, we're going to have this be the default, but if this.state.redirect is true, then we're just going to return early. So we will return a redirect to, and then for the time being, we're just going to redirect back to the root path. So that'll happen if we change our redirect state to true. The other thing that we're going to need to add down here is, like I said, is a toaster. So the way that this actually works, you can interact with Blueprint in a couple different ways, but we're going to interact with it using their actual React component for this one. And that's going to be toaster that has a ref. And this ref is so that we can grab it from our code once again and say what toasts we want. So it's going to be this.toaster. So we're going to call it, and then it's just going to take this particular element. Okay. So we'll do the Facebook authentication first, because I think it's a little bit simpler. And in all of this authentication code, we're going to be working with promises a little bit. So if you haven't seen promises and you aren't really familiar with them, then this might look a little foreign, but I will do my best to explain it as we go on. So we're going to say app auth, and auth is going to be a function here that's going to return some things. And we want sign in with pop-up. Oops. And this will cause the browser to open a new tab, window, pop-up, etc. that is going to let you sign in with Facebook. So it's going to actually punt you off to Facebook, and then you have to authenticate, and then you have to say, hey, the court editor thing wants to use your email. Is that okay? You'll say yes, and then it'll redirect you back to that URL that was inside of Firebase before it gets you back to our application. This will return us a result and an error. If there is an error, we want to put something on our toaster that's going to show this message with the intent of intent.danger and a message of unable to sign in with Facebook. And that's really all we're going to do with that. And then otherwise, we are going to set this.setState of redirect to true. And this will cause the page to redirect us. And so this is what I was talking about with promises. So sign in with pop-up. If you're used to JavaScript before, you've seen a lot of callbacks as the thing. So we would normally like put a function inside of here that would then eventually be ran. So the way that this works though is we'll say .then, and we're expecting to get two things back. That's going to be a result and an error. And if the error exists, we're going to show something if else. But what this actually lets us do is we can have other things. So we can have a catch, we can have more thens if we want to continue further processing things. There's quite a bit you can do with promises. They're pretty powerful. But this should be all we need in order to work with our Facebook auth. So let's make sure everything compiled. It did. And then when we come back over here, I'm going to close this. And when we click login with Facebook, it's going to send us over to our actual rebase or Firebase thing. And then it's going to get us to here. I don't have an icon, but my app name is Court Editor. Continue as you. Yeah, I want that. Now it'll send us back there and actually log us in, but it didn't show us being logged in. And that's because we did a full redirect and that authentication state was lost. So what we need to do is actually interact with the lifecycle of our top level application so that it can check authentication state initially, right when you come to the page, and then render everything. So we've already interacted with these lifecycle events inside of app.js before. And so that'll be in component will mount. So it's in here. And we can add another one using our application auth settings in order to check the authentication right away and to handle something a little bit different when it changes. So we're going to call this remove auth listener, which seems a little weird, but we're going to call it as a function later on. But we're going to do app auth. And then on auth state changed, it's going to give us a user. And then what we want to do is we say if user. That means they authenticated, right? So hold this set state of authenticated to true because they successfully authenticated. And then otherwise, we will do the exact opposite. Whoa. So set this to false. And then the reason we stored this off, similar to how we stored this song ref, is we need to undo this when somebody leaves our application. So unlike using rebase where you remove this binding, in this case, we get to do this.remove auth listener and just call it as a function. So app is not defined because we haven't pulled that in yet. So we will do that now too. Everything compiles and we come back over here and you can see that we're signed in. If you refresh the page with Command R by hitting the refresh button up here, you'll see that it flashes the button first. And that's because it needs to make a request to see if we're logged in and then it can rechange the state. So we're going to add a little bit more state to the application that lets us manage what the application looks like until we know if somebody is signed in. So let's come down here and we're just going to put this as loading. And by default, we're going to set it to true. And then down here, once we have the user, it's safe to say that we're no longer loading. So we'll set that to false and set this to false. And then we can come down to our render function and do something different if loading. So if this state loading is true, we're going to do the same thing we did a little bit ago with the redirect, is we're going to return a different chunk of HTML. So this is going to be a div style of text align, center, position, absolute, top of 25%. We want to put this almost in the very center, but a little just on the top side. And then left of 50%. And what we're actually going to put in here inside this center div is the word loading. And then we're also going to pull in a spinner component, and this is going to come from Blueprint. So we'll come up here and import spinner from Blueprint.js core. So if we save, everything should compile. And now when you refresh the page, you should briefly see loading and this little spinner icon. And that just feels a little bit better. If it took a little longer, it would feel pretty good, and it wouldn't just feel like we broke the application. It'd be very obvious, like, hey, we know it's transitioning. So I think this is good user experience for us. Before we go and build email sign in and sign up, we're going to build logout so that you can actually sign in with a different user. And it might seem like that would be pretty straightforward. You could just have a function somewhere, and you probably could. You could just have a function somewhere, but you'd probably put it on the header at that point, and then it would only be accessible if you clicked a button. And that's not really what we want. We want you to be able to go to a route in order to do that. So if we're going to go to a route, we should probably have a component for it. So we're going to do that now. So let's take a look at components logout.js. And so when we make this particular component, it's an interesting one in the sense that it doesn't render anything at all that is really touchable, interactable by the user itself. We're going to use that same spinner that we just constructed and do something with that. So we're going to say if this.state.redirect is true, then return redirect. So we've seen this before in our header or in our logging component. This is gonna return us back. And then otherwise, we want to return the spinner. So, and unlike in authentication where the state was like, okay, just for temporary, we're gonna show this spinner. In this case, the default state is going to be showing the spinner. So let's go over to app and come down to where we pulled that spinner in. Take this entire thing. And the fact that we are wholesale taking a return block tells me that we could probably turn this into a custom component that is a centered spinner, or loading indicator is something you could call it. And then we will change what's in here to be logging out. And that'll get us pretty far on that. So that's our entire render function. It means we need to import redirect from React Router DOM again. And then we want to import spinner from Blueprint. Then the last thing we need to import here is going to be app from base. And you might be thinking, well, if we're doing this and we have some state, who's changing the state? That's going to come back on doing a component will mount. So we're going to do component will mount, and we're going to create a constructor too to set up our state. Construct or, there we go. And this will have this dot state redirect false. And then as always in a constructor, you need to call super. So in component will mount is where we do all the real logic of this. It's going to have app auth again, and then they give us a sign out function that will then return us something. So it returns a promise of its own that gives us a user, and it also could give us an error, but we don't actually want to do anything with that error. And we'll say this set state redirect true, and that is all we need to do. So this logout is pretty simple, and it's going to handle all the logging out. So this means we could use this from legitimately anywhere. And unfortunately, I guess it would be a little bit different in the sense that since we're using this loading spinner, it has to sort of be a route. You couldn't render it inside of something as like a button. And there might be a way to do that too, but right now we're not going to worry about that. So we'll come into app, and we are going to import logout. from our components, logout. And then what we're going to do is create basically that exact same route again. So we'll copy this, change into out. Now we have a means of logging out. So if, oh, whoops, I put that inside the return in our logout. So that's not quite right. We need to move this and that and even these back out. Now everything compiles and we should be good to go. So we are currently signed in. If we come up here and we go to /logout, it will sign us out, give us a loading, puts us back over here. When we click this, it takes us back. We sign in. Since we've already authorized the Facebook application, it'll just directly log us in. So that worked out great for us. And here we go again. So we will, the last thing we need to do is add a way for you to actually click something up here. So we're going to add a new icon in order to log out. So let's go to our header and quickly add that. And that's going to be a button like these. And instead of having a cog icon, we're going to have a logout. And instead of being a button, it's actually going to be a link. And that is going to go to the /logout route. And we're not actually going to put any content in this. And since we're not putting any content into the link, screen readers can't actually read this in a useful way. So we're going to set an ARIA label that says logout. And this is to help anybody who needs the reading assistance on our application be able to know what this button does if they, for instance, can't see it. Everything compiled, but we can't see our thing. So let's go back, take a look, make sure this worked right. So we have, oh, whoops, put it on the wrong side. I put it in the event that you were already logged out. That's not very useful. Okay, now we have a logout button. We click this, it'll log us out. So we're finally ready to set up the email sign up and sign in. So we're doing 2 steps in this. And like I said, we have a couple different cases. The user attempts to use the email password, but they already signed in with Facebook. We need to show them kind of less of an error, more of like a, hey, you already have an account, but it's not with email password. And then we need to register them if they don't exist. And if they do exist, we need to either sign them in or validate their password and give them an error if it's wrong. One thing you can do is if you go over here and you take a look at the users, if we refresh this, you should see that I have a me@keiththompson.com user for the Facebook provider. So now if I come over here and use this, that'll be the case where we need to show them something else. So we're going to go and write up the way to handle this using promises again, which this would be a more complicated use of promises and how you can chain promises together in a cool way to accomplish something. So let's go check it out. So we need to keep the event prevent default. That's not going to go away. And then what we want to do is we want to get the email off of this.email input .value, and then we need to get the password also. But for us to do what we want to do, we actually need to make a couple different requests. So we need to use auth again to fetch providers for email. And what this does is it lets us take an email address and go and find anybody who has, oh, whoops, that's not right. It's going to return some providers to us, but it's going to let us take the email address and go see if anybody has an account with that email address, and if so, how they signed up. We have this then for providers. And like I said, when we were talking about this earlier, we could get an error in our then. And that's true, you can get an error, and you can handle it with this, or you can actually chain a catch that is there to only handle errors onto your chain of promises. And so we're going to do that now. So there, in our particular cases here, anytime we hit an error in this stretch of promises, we want to do the same thing. So we want to do this.toaster show, and then we're going to have an intent again, and the intent is danger once again. And then we want to show the message, and we're actually going to show the error message itself. So I think that Firebase does a pretty good job with their errors, so it's safe for us to just kind of pass these on. If if our app becomes bigger and we want to customize the verbiage of this, then they actually do a really good job of giving you error codes so that you can identify what exactly happened and you can translate that into your own custom messages. We're not going to do that right now, though. So in this case, we have these providers, and if the provider's length is 0, then that's going to tell us that this particular person doesn't have an account. And then we have an else. That would be if providers.index of password is the name of the provider. That will be if you're using email password. If the index of that is equal to -1, then we know that they didn't sign up with email password. So this is, let's go over this. This is create user. This is they used Facebook. And otherwise, this will be to sign the user in. So these are the 3 paths that we get to work with here. So we'll handle this. They used Facebook one first because it's easy to demonstrate and it's doesn't actually require anything. So this.toaster show, we're going to give it an intent again. And this intent is going to be, whoa, too many options there. Intent is going to be warning because we don't want it to be read. We don't want them to think that there was like a big problem. It's just they need to try an alternative login. And that might not even be the best way to word this. But if we save this and we make sure everything compiled, which it did, so we're good. Oh, it's actually not gonna, did I type that wrong? Yep, I did. There we go, providers. So now if you sign in with Facebook, we know that works. Didn't change anything there, but we know that I have an account with this particular thing. So if I fill in a password and I do this, it's gonna go and say, hey, try an alternative. And so this, we handled one of our paths already. That was good. Actually, I think what we should do here is we will clear the form on this too. So we can say this.login form.reset. So now let's try that again. There, that really should indicate to them like, hey, seriously, this don't fill out this form. You want to use something else. So that's pretty good. So let's handle create user as our next one. And in this, remember what I said that you can chain promises together. So we are actually going to create another promise. Since we made one request, got a promise, and now we need to make another request that's going to give us another promise. We can either nest these things really deep if we wanted to, or we could just return that promise and then handle it further down into the chain. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to say app auth create user with email and password, email password. And that's it. That's our entire create user step. And then what we're going to do is come down here in the same chain, and we're going to add another promise handler, another then statement that's going to say if user and he has an email, he or she, I guess, then we want to do that same thing again. We'll do the login form, reset. And this is just so that if somebody navigates to us using push state in some way, that they're not going to come back to a form that's already pre-populated. And then the last thing is this dot set state, redirect, true. And that'll be it. And if by chance this particular new promise line hits an error, it will still be caught by the same toaster line, so we won't have to worry about it. So that handled all of create user, and if everything goes according to plan, then we'll hit this right here. And then for sign in, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to say app auth, sign in with email and password. And that's it. We're entirely added. So let's go take this thing for a spin. So I will use my keith@coderjourney.com email address and set up a new password. And it went off and signed me in. And if we take a look at our users inside of the Firebase dashboard, you'll see that I have a new one. So now if I log out, come back, and we use that same email address, the most obvious error that we can reproduce is if there's a bad password. And it looks like it actually did something wrong for us here. So I filled out me, and then I put in a bad password, and it gives us try alternative login. So I actually did something wrong. and that it is being caught by a different toaster. Oh, it's because I spelled password wrong. That's fun. Okay, so let's save that again. And if we fill this back out, the password is invalid or the user does not have a password. So it gives us the kind of error that we expect. And if we go and we create a new test email for this and we submit it, it should create a new user once again. So there you go. That's the tutorial for today. It's really long and I hope it was valuable to you, but we covered a lot in how you can do this in React and how you can use Firebase and authentication using OAuth and even email and password to facilitate sign up and user sign in. There's a lot here. So if you need some help following along, or if you have any questions, leave comments down below or go to the blog. The blog article has all the code in detail and the snippets that we go from adding things. So it's broken down in sections. So if you haven't checked out the blog and how we go over this code there, then I encourage you to do that. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, be sure to leave a comment down below telling me why you liked it and what you're going to do with this knowledge. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you can get more of these tutorials each week. And also don't forget to join us on Patreon, Facebook, Slack, so you can keep the chat going, and on Twitter. But as always, have a nice week.